December 22nd, 1944, Bastogne, Belgium. The frozen earth cracked underfoot as Private Leo Palmer pressed his gloved hands to his rifle and peered through the mist that clung to the foxholes like ghosts. The air was sharp, filled with the metallic scent of frost and gunpowder. From the haze ahead, 4 German soldiers appeared, carrying white flags. One officer, tall and stiff, clutched a black briefcase under his arm. For 3 endless days, 12,000 American soldiers of the 101st Airborne had been surrounded by 5 German armored divisions. They were starving, freezing, and running dangerously low on ammunition. And now, it seemed, the enemy was coming not with tanks, but with terms. What neither side knew that morning was that this moment would echo through history. A single exchange between 2 commanders would reveal something profound, that there existed an unbridgeable gulf between 2 armies, 2 philosophies of war, and 2 cultures. It was not a gap that could be measured by weapons or tactics, but by spirit, by the way men understood the very meaning of fighting, of surrender, of duty. The Germans came expecting reason. What they would receive was something they could never have imagined. It had begun 6 days earlier, on December 16, 1944, when Adolf Hitler, desperate to reverse Germany's collapsing fortunes, launched his final gamble. The plan was audacious: drive 200,000 troops and nearly 1,000 tanks through the Ardennes forest, split the Allied line, and capture the vital port of Antwerp. The assault struck like lightning, just as it had in 1940, catching thinly spread American units off guard. It was the last great German offensive on the Western Front. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. In the chaos of those first days, towns were swallowed whole. The skies turned gray with snow and smoke. Hitler's generals, among them General Heinrich von Luttwitz, raced to seize Bastogne, a small Belgian crossroads that most Americans had never even heard of. But Bastogne sat at the hub of 7 major roads, each one radiating like a spoke in a wheel. Whoever held that town controlled the movement of men and machines across the entire southern sector. Von Luttwitz knew that without Bastogne, the German advance would stall. The town had to be taken. The Americans defending Bastogne were an improvised mix of units thrown together in haste. The 101st Airborne Division, battle-hardened veterans of Normandy and Holland, had been resting in France when General Eisenhower made his decision. He ordered them forward immediately. Move to Bastogne. Hold it. They went without hesitation. On the night of December 17th, the paratroopers climbed into open trucks, shivering under sleet and snow. They had no winter gear, no extra ammunition, and wore the same thin uniforms they'd jumped into Normandy with months earlier. They rode through darkness and freezing rain, 100 miles toward the sound of distant thunder. By the time they arrived on December 19th, the Germans were already closing in. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, temporarily in command while General Maxwell Taylor was in Washington, organized the defenses with calm precision. McAuliffe was a quiet, practical man. Not famous, not flashy, but his men trusted him completely. Around Bastogne, he positioned his forces in a rough circle. Paratroopers on the north, tank destroyers to the east, glider infantry to the south. He filled the gaps with engineers, cooks, clerks, anyone who could hold a rifle. Every man knew they would be surrounded. The question wasn't if, but for how long they could hold. By December 20th, the German noose had tightened. The 2nd Panzer, Panzer Lehr, and the 26th Volksgrenadier Divisions encircled the town. They outnumbered the Americans 5-1. They had tanks, artillery, and supplies. The men in Bastogne had little but grit and each other. The snow deepened. The temperatures dropped below freezing. The wounded lay in cellars without morphine. Air support was grounded by fog. The situation was desperate. But to the men of the 101st, desperation was nothing new. They were paratroopers. volunteers who had leapt into the dark over Normandy, fought in Holland, and held impossible positions before. They lived by a creed that was burned into their hearts. I never surrender, though I be the last. It wasn't just a slogan. It was their way of life. To them, being surrounded wasn't tragedy. It was Tuesday. The German attacks came relentlessly. Artillery rained down on the town, reducing stone houses to rubble. Tanks prowled the outskirts, their engines growling in the fog. Each time the Germans attacked, the paratroopers fought them off with everything they had. The 75th Tank Destroyer Battalion's M18 Hellcats picked off 40 German tanks in deadly ambushes. American artillery, massed in the center of the perimeter, fired in all directions, pounding enemy formations until the ground shook. Despite the odds, Bastogne held. And then, on the morning of December 22nd, came the white flags. 4 German officers approached, escorted through the lines under guard. They carried an ultimatum typed on fine German stationery: surrender or be annihilated. General von Lüttwitz offered the Americans honorable terms, warning that if they refused, German artillery would obliterate the town within 2 hours. The message made its way through the ranks until it reached General McAuliffe, who had just been roused from a brief, exhausted sleep. Reading the letter, McAuliffe frowned. Then he laughed. "Nuts," he said. His staff blinked in confusion. "What should we tell them, sir?" one asked. McAuliffe shrugged. "What I said, nuts." His men grinned. It was the perfect response. Simple, defiant, and pure McAuliffe. They typed it neatly onto official letterhead. To the German commander, nuts, the American commander. When the message was handed back to the German officers, they looked puzzled. "Was ist das, nuts?" Colonel Joseph Harper, the American who delivered it, smirked. "It means go to hell." The Germans stiffened, saluted, and turned away. That single word, spoken half in jest, would become one of the most iconic moments in American military history. A one-word manifesto of defiance. But beneath the humor lay something deeper. Von Lüttwitz's demand had come from a long European tradition, one where surrender in hopeless situations was not shameful but rational, a way to preserve lives for another fight. McAuliffe's answer came from a different world entirely. A culture of volunteers who had already accepted death as the price of the mission. The German commander believed he was being reasonable. McAuliffe simply didn't play by those rules. The weather broke the next day. The gray skies lifted, and with them came salvation from above. Hundreds of C-47s droned overhead, parachuting crates of food, ammunition, and medical supplies into the besieged town. For the first time in days, the men of Bastogne smiled. Soon after, P-47 Thunderbolts screamed across the sky, tearing into German armor and supply lines. The tide was turning. Christmas Eve arrived under heavy fire. The Germans launched their strongest assault yet, breaking through briefly before McAuliffe's men counterattacked and pushed them back. That night, by candlelight and flickering lanterns, McAuliffe issued a message to his troops. He acknowledged their hardships, the bitter cold, the longing for home, but he reminded them that they had stopped everything the Germans had thrown at them, that they were giving their country a worthy Christmas present. He ended simply, "Merry Christmas!" The men read his words by the light of tracer fire and smiled. They believed him. Meanwhile, General George S. Patton's Third Army was fighting its way north through the snow. He had turned his entire force 90 degrees to relieve Bastogne, a maneuver so audacious that even his staff doubted it could be done. The 4th Armored Division led the charge. For days, they fought through towns and ambushes until, on December 26th, they broke through. Lieutenant Charles Bogus's Sherman tank, Cobra King, rumbled into Bastogne and met the 101st's engineers. The siege was over, but if the outside world celebrated the rescue of Bastogne, the men of the 101st did not. They never believed they needed rescuing. When McAuliffe later met reporters in Paris, He clarified, almost with irritation, that his division had never asked for help, only for surgeons. To the paratroopers, they hadn't been saved. They had held their mission. Everything else was just logistics. That distinction, the refusal to see themselves as rescued, became part of the legend. It spoke to something larger than pride. It revealed how differently these men saw their duty. For conventional armies, surrender or retreat could be strategic decisions. For the airborne, they were impossible. They didn't fight to survive. They fought to complete the mission, whatever the cost. That mindset, so alien to the German officers who had offered honorable surrender, was what made the word nuts so powerful. It wasn't defiance for show. It was truth. The siege of Bastogne lasted until mid-January. When the paratroopers were finally relieved from the lines, they left not as survivors, but as victors who had accomplished their orders to the letter. They had denied the Germans the crossroads, broken their momentum, and helped doom Hitler's last offensive. The cost was terrible. Hundreds dead, thousands wounded, but the victory was complete. And the legend of Bastogne was sealed. In the years after the war, those who had been there carried that legend with them. McAuliffe was promoted, later commanding U.S. Army Europe. Harry Kinnard, the man who'd reminded him to say nuts, rose to general and led troops in Vietnam. Creighton Abrams, who broke the siege, would become Army Chief of Staff, and the M1 Abrams tank would one day bear his name. Even decades later, at reunions and interviews, the men of Bastogne would all say the same thing. We weren't rescued. Their defiance became a lesson passed down through generations of American paratroopers. Recruits at jump school learned the story of Bastogne as gospel. They learned that being surrounded wasn't disaster. It was the job. That surrender was never an option. That courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to fight anyway. The men who wore the screaming eagle patch inherited that legacy like a sacred oath. In the end, the story of Bastogne wasn't just about holding a town. It was about what kind of soldiers America had become. The Germans fought by logic and tradition. The Americans fought by will and belief. One side measured odds. The other simply refused to yield. When McAuliffe wrote that single word, he defined not just a battle, but a culture. One built on audacity, endurance, and the unshakable conviction that no matter the odds, you do not quit. And so, in the frost and fury of that Belgian winter, surrounded by tanks and artillery, one man's simple word, nuts, became the voice of an entire generation. A word that still echoes through the history of the 101st Airborne Division, reminding every soldier who wears the eagle patch that surrender is never in their vocabulary.